Before we announce new grants, I will provide a brief overview of the goals and activities of the Southern Ontario Nature Coalition. SONC focuses on nature in Canada's largest urbanized region, Southern Ontario. Globally, the loss and fragmentation of nature on the fringe of growing urban areas is a concern. And Southern Ontario fits that narrative as one of Canada's most biodiverse regions, but also home to the highest concentration of species at risk. SONC is a partnership of experienced provincial, regional, Indigenous, agricultural, community-based organizations, and land-based policy experts, and it's committed to engaging Indigenous peoples and communities in accordance with community protocols and the development of ethical space for all to contribute meaningfully. Each partner in the coalition has brought unique experience, perspective, and expertise to the table, generating some very rich discussions. Next slide. Hopefully these reports will be familiar to some of you joining us today. Last July, we released final and technical reports for the Near Urban Nature Network, a solution to climate change and biodiversity loss. These reports are both the result of an unprecedented examination of options to protect nature in the Greenbelt and surrounding Greater Golden Horseshoe. Recommendations are guiding SONC's continued collaboration and are behind the grant announcements here today. We will provide a link to these reports in the chat. Funding for this initial work was provided by the federal government through the Canada Nature Fund and by the province of Ontario through the Greenbelt Foundation. And the funding really enabled the coalition to do this work, so it was greatly appreciated. Next slide. The Near Urban Nature Network outlines solutions to conserve, steward, and protect nature for all living things. The solutions take a pluralistic approach because we live in a large population area with diverse peoples, and a pluralistic approach will really help us to engage a broad range of community partners and people based on how they value nature and interact with nature. These different approaches consist of a nature for nature approach, where we're looking for solutions to conserve wildlife by reversing the decline in biodiversity loss, a nature for culture approach, increasing access to nature and stewardship opportunities for Indigenous peoples and all residents, agricultural and farmers too, do a lot of stewardship work. Nature for society approach, helping to address community priorities such as the need for green space, climate change and community resilience building, and of course, jobs and economic benefits from restoration efforts, and agriculture and outdoor tourism and recreation in the region. So these approaches really recognize Indigenous rights and responsibilities towards caring for nature. They also recognize the high level of private land ownership and agricultural ownership in the region, and the realities of competing visions for land use in urban areas. And on top of that, community need. Next. Here in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, we, to the left here on the map, is the Greenbelt. And the Greater Golden Horseshoe and the Greenbelt together provide a unique framework for Canada to conserve nature in urban areas. And this framework is based on a regional land use planning regime that's quite unique in Canada. It really clarifies where development will happen and where it won't happen for generations to come. It elevates the importance of conserving natural, water, and agricultural systems that surround and intersect local communities, and acknowledges the benefits that those provide. And this regional planning lens, we have found here, because the Greenbelt is it's about 17 years old, really is complementing local and watershed planning, and it better enables us to conserve connectivity across Southern Ontario and climate corridors north. So it's a really good perspective to have in this region when we're looking particularly at biodiversity. Next. It is worth noting and celebrating that Canada has one of the world's largest greenbelts, and certainly its most robust when it comes to its vision and its policies. The Greenbelt has helped increase understanding of the benefits of conserving nature in urban areas. It's 2.1 million acres of farmland, forests, wetlands, rivers, grasslands, lakes. These features provide 3.2 billion in ecosystem services each year. And as part of that, 379 million is in annual flood control cost savings. A quick look at some of the key findings of the report. Southern Ontario, including the Greater Golden Horseshoe, is one of the most biodiverse regions in Canada, but it is also where nature and biodiversity are most at risk. This map represents a report by the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which showed that in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, it overlaps with two different crisis ecoregions, areas where biodiversity values and threats are higher than the rest of the country. The Great Lakes, as you can see, which surround the Greater Golden Horseshoe at the bottom of this map, the Great Lakes also pose a continental barrier for some, maybe not birds, but some species movement between the US and Canada. The size of the Greater Golden Horseshoe's urban footprint in this region makes ecological connectivity critical through the Greater Golden Horseshoe. It's going to connect Southern Ontario from the east to the west. Protected area status is also very low in the region at 3%. And, that means we need to look at, increasing protected and conserved area status in the region, including Indigenous protected areas and conserved areas, but we also need to look at other solutions to conserve nature. Solutions may be found in some land use planning policies and programs. Next slide. Cores and corridors. This good news is that this map really shows that there is lots of opportunity in the region to do what we need to do to protect and conserve nature. There's an abundance of near urban nature, both in and outside the Greenbelt. But we need to act fast and build on the success of the Greenbelt to get this work done. Connectivity currently remains through the region. You can see at this scale in the map to your right, that the Greenbelt's natural heritage system is visibly intact throughout the region. And it provides opportunities to enhance connections then beyond its borders, as depicted by those blue and yellow areas. So the blue areas show water connectivity, and the yellow areas more terrestrial connectivity. In the Hamilton region on this map lies the Coots to Escarpment Eco Park system in the Hamilton-Burlington area. Partners of the park have already mapped some ecological corridors that show opportunities to connect that park to the Greenbelt, down to Lake Ontario, and then further west into the Greater Golden Horseshoe and Southwestern Ontario. This map also shows that habitat cores are plenty. The green data in its entirety really show opportunities for conserving more natural areas, and these are largely forests, wetlands, grasslands, areas of natural scientific interest, and provincial wildlife areas. And these are really high value habitats. Additional maps and data in the report also show findings that highlight increasing climate change impacts for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And these include increasing flooding, rising number of extreme heat days that will be experienced by residents, and water quality and quantity concerns. Other data shows that when planning for large quality green space in the region, it's actually falling behind current levels needed to maintain current access. So as the population grows over the next 3 decades, the tune of 4 million, currently we are not planning for enough large green space to accommodate those population numbers. So I wanted to just pause for a moment, really to underline, the urgency to act, conserve, and recognize the importance of nature to the resilience of our planet and our communities. And this is true in Canada's most remote and urban settings. So we know this is a big job for Canada, but we also know that, here in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, that this issue can really unite a lot of community partners throughout the entire region. And so we think it's an issue that can effectively be tackled. Finally, I'd like to go over a couple of recommendations that are in the report. We've listed some here as some of the more priority recommendations. And those include, as part of these recommendations, we really encourage the federal and provincial governments to work with us to identify funding opportunities to support this work. Part of this work includes a national strategy to protect near urban nature with an integrated funding program that supports capacity for regional collaboration across urban areas. We also want to highlight funding is needed to Indigenous peoples to really support their capacity to participate. And we've seen sort of recent federal provincial actions that are a positive step in the direction of some of these recommendations. And we thought it appropriate to mention some of those today. So some of the, in the next slide, some of the federal commitments and actions, for example, is this commitment to halt and reverse biodiversity loss in Canada. And this is a real strong directive that is needed here. And also the more familiar conserving 25% of Canada's land, freshwater, and oceans by 2025, and working towards a 30% by 2030 target. The federal government also announced a $2.3 billion investment in projects that address biodiversity, climate change, and protect and create jobs. That includes NRCan's 2 billion tree commitment. And what's notable about that particular fund is it does have a capacity building fund complementing the planting of trees. There's also the Climate Smart Nature-Based Solutions Fund, which includes a focus on agriculture. And more recently, just last week, I believe, Parks Canada announced a new national program on ecological corridors, sort of the first of its kind in Canada, to my knowledge. Some provincial commitments and actions is the Canada and Ontario joint commitment to Indigenous rights and priorities in conservation through the One with Nature report. There is also the Provincial Working Group on Protected Areas, which did some work over the past year and to identify more opportunities. There's been some subsequent announcements. And there's been some support for the province to actually support the identification of OECMs in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which is another protected areas tool. And there's also the Growing the Greenbelt process, which acknowledges the importance of ecological connectivity through the region. And as immediate next step, SONC partners have committed to undertaking a series of actions ourselves. These are outlined in the report under the Path Forward recommendations, and we have already made progress on some of these while we are announcing others today. These actions include continuing to engage local Indigenous communities, communicating the vision and importance of the Near Urban Nature Network, accelerating opportunities to establish protected and conserved areas in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, identifying opportunities for regional planning to improve access to nature, leading significant or supporting significant ecosystem restoration projects, and launching a native seed strategy pilot. We're also interested in more pan-Canadian conversations to advance protection of nature across Canada. So to get to the announcements, on behalf of the Foundation, I am pleased to announce our target investments in 3 projects that address key recommendations in SONC. Projects include a native plant seed strategy from Carolinian Canada, the establishment of important connectivity lands around Rouge National Urban Park from Wildlands League, and a project from Ontario Nature that assesses municipal and conservation authority lands towards Canada's 2025 protected areas target. First off, we're pleased to join us is Sarah Winterton of Carolinian Canada, and she will introduce the Southern Ontario Seed Strategy Project. The strategy addresses the need for increased seed supply to enhance and restore resilient nature in the region, and is in coordination with Indigenous, conservation, agriculture, and native plant nursery leaders. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks, Shelley. And thanks, Ed, very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to share the context, vision, and objectives for the Southern Ontario Seed Strategy. Just wanted to do a quick introduction of the Carolinian Canada SOS team. It includes Samantha White-Eye, Indigenous Leadership Specialist, Stephen Weber, Carolinian Zone Ecologist, Verlin James, Program Specialist, Denise Miller, Wildlife Habitat Intern, myself, Program Development Specialist, and Michelle Cantor, Executive Director. Next slide, please. Shelley's laid out the challenge really well. We're looking at the declining habitat and species across Southern Ontario, and it's particularly low in the Carolinian Zone region of the province at less than 15%. We want to reverse this trend and grow to 30%, at least 30% by 2030. And fundamental to achieving this goal is a Southern Ontario seed strategy that supports native plants, because we know native plants are the foundation of healthy ecosystems and habitat. The seed strategy journey that we're outlining seeks to restore our relationships with native plants. And the four main goals around it are here on the slide. First one is about respecting the autonomy of native plants. This includes their diversity, their history, their cultural importance, their importance to other species, and to a healthy functioning ecosystem. It's also about healing the land and acknowledging how colonization has changed this landscape and continues to push native plants to the margins. It represents an important action of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Another goal is around saving species. There are many rare and at-risk plants across Southern Ontario, particularly in the Carolinian Zone. And a seed strategy includes a focus on these rare and at-risk species, as well as common native plants, so we can protect their genetic diversity and boost their populations. Fourthly, we're looking at how we can invest in strengthening systems that will support the growth of the native plant sector. It's an important part of a regenerative economy that will bring together the different efforts of different groups across the landscape. The horticultural industry generates hundreds of millions of dollars of activity annually, producing mostly non-native species. There's room to grow more native plants for different markets, and we know that the demand is rising. Next slide, please. A coordinated regional seed strategy aims to align and connect the different efforts and perspectives that are currently going on throughout the region. But first, we need the time and space to create ethical space to do this work. The Southern Ontario Seed Strategy needs to be grounded in a strong relationship between Indigenous and settler-led seed initiatives. And to do that, we need to address accountability, reciprocity, and support Indigenous leadership. And this is the point that we're at in the process at the moment, is really taking the time to create that ethical space. Looking at why, like, a regional focus, the graph there on the right kind of summarizes it. And if you look at the x-axis, we've got 5 different ways to source seeds, from wild collection to cultivar production. And looking at the y-axis, you've got 4 different desired traits for seeds used in restoration. So what this shows is that a regional approach will increase through the farming of managed seed orchards derived from multiple seed populations within the region. It hits the sweet spot, which is that area within the purple rectangle, where it shows a balance of medium to high levels of all of the desired traits that we want to be working with within a seed strategy and in bringing native plants back to the landscape. As part of the Southern Ontario Nature Coalition work, we're also engaged in doing surveys with stakeholders. And one of the important things that emerged from that survey is the identification of the need for a native seed strategy by over 75% of the participants. So we know that this is a strategy that is urgently needed across the landscape. Next slide, please. The other thing that a seed strategy creates is the opportunity to really grow community. And this is where we come back to the idea of connecting and aligning all of the different perspectives and activities that are already underway. It's an very active space and growing. So we're looking here at, we've identified a few of the connecting opportunities, a few of the communities that will be engaging through the strategy, ranging from the coordination with Indigenous leadership in ethical space around accountability, all the different leaders who want to protect and grow climate resilient seed orchards for the diversity of native plants that should be on the landscape. And we see this as a collective living strategy. It's something that is underway, but it's going to be a lifetime of work. And in order to bring back the diversity of healthy populations of native plants on the landscape. We also know that there are many landowners out there who are eager to grow healthy habitats. So through this project, we're going to be supporting them with learning opportunities. And we have also got gardeners from rural to urban situations that are tuning into the opportunity to grow native plants and how they help bring back biodiversity, no matter where their garden is. So you're looking at pollinators, things like that. And all of these communities working together, contributing to a seed strategy, is ultimately going to help support the efforts of the native plant growers so that we can start to address some of the key issues of supply and demand that we are grappling with right now. We know that we, through the work with the Southern Ontario Nature Coalition, we know that there is a big need to address supply and demand related to quantity of native seed that's available, and also diversity of seed and plants that are being made available for the market, for restoration projects, for wherever they're needed. Next slide, please. Within the Southern Ontario Nature Coalition, we developed a suite of 10 recommendations that would help to move this forward. And they're all outlined here. I'm not going to dive into each and every one of them, but a number of them are already underway and others will emerge over time. And what I really want to do is thank the Greenbelt Foundation for their support for this initiative, and also thank the partnership that we've developed with the Canadian Wildlife Federation and Environment and Climate Change Canada for their support as well. We're also grateful for this list of organizations here for their support, and other partners that are coming on board and getting behind this effort. The list is growing. So I want to thank you for this opportunity to share this, and please stay tuned for much more to come. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Dave Pierce with the Wildlands League is up next, introducing a connected and resilient Greenbelt project. It supports cores and corridors approach to protecting biodiversity in the region. Dave?
Thanks, Shelley. And I want to echo Sarah's thanks for the support of the Greenbelt Foundation, and thanks for everybody that's joining today. Good afternoon. I love hearing what Caroline in Canada is up to. It's always inspiring, and though I've heard Sarah give that presentation before, it just shows the great partnerships in the Southern Ontario Nature coalition. So I'm Senior Forest Conservation Manager with Wildlands League, and we're one of the groups that seeks to protect wild areas by both establishing new protected areas, but also working outside these to conserve what's increasingly obvious that we need to conserve connected landscapes. So we're part of a nationwide network of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, which is CPAWS, as well as a member of SONC. So this map shows our nature connectivity map, and I think Shelley and others have laid out the context pretty well. That Canada's pledged to halt and reverse biodiversity loss and reach 30% protection by 2030, and this landscape is really essential to establishing or achieving those goals, especially given the number of species at risk and the high human population pressures and the amount of land that's set aside, the low amount of land that's set aside for nature. So in the Wildlands League, our nature connectivity project, we have a vision that we share, I'm sure, with everybody on this call, is a connection between Tobermory and Kawarthas, and between Windsor and Algonquin Park. And there's several opportunities that we're kind of looking at and focused on, including connecting the Greater Golden Horseshoe through Central Ontario and up through. There's a sort of a archipelago of stepping stone protection up to Algonquin Park. We're looking at the Thames River Valley and London. If you recall Sarah's map of some of the community growing community projects, there's a green swath down through there that has huge potential, and we're also actively working in Windsor to include the federal piece of the Ojibwe Shores property within a new national urban park, the Ojibwe National Urban Park. So we're excited about that project. But our main focus today is working around expanding protection and connection around Rouge National Urban Park. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this project focuses on protecting and enhancing connectivity between Rouge and adjacent Greenbelt lands and watersheds, and including Duffin's Creek and the headwaters of the Don, and even perhaps the Humber River, as well as Oak Ridge's Moraine and Lake Ontario. And we kind of zooming in, if you remember Shelley's map of the cores and corridors concept, we're going to take a more granular approach and zoom in and expand on that concept on a kind of a smaller landscape here. Next slide, please. So we have three, and by the way, the slides look much better now that Brianna has had a crack at them from what I sent her. So I'm looking at them and going, wow, they look really good now. There's three main aspects: Indigenous engagement with 4 directions of conservation consulting, Gary Pritchard and his shop, working on ecological corridors with Parks Canada, relying on guidance from the IUCN, and then with obviously with our SONC partners and others, and then a road ecology component with EcoCare International, which is headed up by Carrie Gunson. And we're also looking at trying to identify mechanisms to, once the cores and corridors, the corridors are identified, looking at mechanisms to preserve and restore these corridors. And we'll be doing broader communications and outreach. And Eugenia Kwok from our team is the lead on that front, and she's in the audience, so I want to give Eugenia a shout out. Next slide, please. So working with 4 directions, we're working with Gary and Jeff Driscoll and his shop to engage the 7 Williams Treaty communities plus the Mississaugas and the New Credit as a focus to explore their interests and support their interests and around road ecology and connectivity around the Rouge. Next slide. And working with Parks Canada to identify the critical corridors for protecting and restoring connectivity within the Rouge National Urban Park greater ecosystem and adjacent Greenbelt lands. So we're relying on core guidance from IOCN, and then further guidance is being developed by Parks Canada to sort of provide a made in Canada guidance on this concept. As a segue to talking about road ecology, Carrie Gunson actually did a project with Parks Canada looking at road ecology. So if we go to the next slide, working with Carrie on doing road ecology work outside Rouge National Urban Park. And this was really inspired by joint work that we did with, again, with 4 Directions and EcoCare International, as well as the Muskoka Conservancy, as the Couchiching and Couchiching Conservancy, around identifying Corps' hotspots for road ecology and low-cost mitigation measures around the Highway 11 corridor north of Lake Simcoe, as well as a road ecology and citizen science component that Carrie conducted there. And as I said, she just finished a project within Rouge National Urban Park, so we're going to take some of these examples and expand it outside the Rouge. Next slide, please. So kind of a status update on what we're doing and some next steps. So Gary and Jeff from 4 Directions and I met last week, and we're working on contracts and a work plan, including identifying specific times in the communities to avoid engagement, because that's going to be key to identify. And they're currently working on letters of engagement to the communities. And then again, I spoke to Omar McDaddy, superintendent of Rouge Park, and he's connecting me with their ecologist, and we'll be picking their brains on road ecology and connectivity in that area, and also reaching out to partners in SONC and beyond that have done connectivity work and corridor work. Greenbelt Foundation, Coutts Escarpment have done their own cores and corridors work, obviously, and other collaborators to make sure we're adding value to work that's already existing. And we're also working with our CPAWS network to learn from the road ecology work that they're doing across the country that's being headed up by Parks Canada. And then Carrie and I spoke just yesterday, and we also are drafting up our work plan, and that's going to include a geographic scoping exercise, planning field work focused in June and the fall, the migrating periods of intensity for reptiles and amphibians, doing some hotspot mapping, and like I said, a road ecology workshop, which we're planning for September, which will include also a kind of a hands-on field component. So that's kind of where we're at for now, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer period and following up with your interest.
Thanks so much, Dave. You know, what's really great about all these projects is they have very strong partnerships, and that is also the case with the next one. Anne Bell from Ontario Nature is going to talk about the Assessing Land Towards Canada's 2025 Protected Areas Target project. And this is a partnership with municipalities and conservation authorities in the region. Anne?
Thanks very much, Shelley. And thanks everybody who's proceeded with sort of setting out the scope and the wonderful partnerships that define the Southern Ontario Nature Coalition. I'm joining today from Ottawa on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. I'm out of town. Normally I'd be speaking from from Toronto. Anyway, today I'm going to be speaking about a project that we're undertaking in partnership with Conservation Ontario and with the generous funding of the Greenbelt Foundation. It's been described already, so I don't need to go into further details about sort of the general scope of the project, But let's go on to the next slide. First, just a little bit of information about the organization that I represent, Ontario Nature. We're a charitable conservation organization that represents over 30,000 members and supporters across the province and over 150 member groups. We've been around since 1931, and our mission is to protect wild species and wild spaces through conservation, education, and public engagement. We're very happy to partner with the Greenbelt Foundation and others on this webinar today as a member of the Southern Ontario Nature Coalition. Next slide, please. So as Shelley mentioned earlier, Canada has embraced ambitious new international protected areas targets to protect 25% of our lands and waters by 2025 and at least 30% by 2030. These targets represent a giant step forward from where we were earlier under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, where the target was to protect 17% by 2020. However, as many of you probably know, Canada didn't meet the 17% target. Currently, we're at about 13.5%, but there appears to be a real appetite to do better, and that's good news because the 30% target is much closer to what scientists tell us is the very minimum necessary to halt biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. In Ontario, we have a long way to go. We've protected less than 11% of our lands and waters. But one thing that we haven't fully and accurately reflected in this total are the conservation lands of municipalities and conservation authorities. These lands are, of course, vitally important to conserving the diversity of species and natural areas across Ontario. And so it's important that we take stock and that we do our utmost to manage near urban natural areas to a high standard. And that's what this project is all about. So far, 6 municipalities and 12 conservation authorities in Ontario have had some lands assessed and counted towards Canada's target. The sites assessed vary considerably in size and in type of designation. They include conservation areas, municipal parks, environmentally significant areas, lands within county forests, and so on. Next slide, please. One thing that all of these areas have in common is that they meet these 4 criteria. They have clearly defined boundaries. They have effective means of controlling activities likely to negatively impact biodiversity. The protection provided is long-term and difficult to reverse, and they're managed so that conservation outcomes are achieved. Interestingly, though, they don't necessarily have to have conservation as the primary objective, and this is significant. Lands can count toward the federal target even if they're managed primarily for other purposes, as long as they meet these 4 criteria. In that case, they're known as other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs. Next slide, please. A great example of an OECM is the Queen's University Biological Station. It was established for research over 70 years ago, but it meets all 4 criteria, and so it counts toward the federal protected areas targets. So do the other places listed on this slide: Scanlon Creek Conservation Area, Warsaw Caves Conservation Area, and the special management zones in Northumberland County Forest. Next slide, please. For our project this year, we're going to be working with about 6 to 8 municipalities and conservation authorities to assess their conservation lands. This involves identifying the sites and gathering information about all the policies, plans, and tools that are relevant to their management from a conservation perspective. Then we work to apply the federal screening tool and write up the assessment. Then the draft assessment is reviewed by the Ontario Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, and we get to work with some wonderful staff in that department. And finally, the ministry submits the assessment to the ECCC for review and entry into Canada's Protected Areas database. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the broader project and timeline, which involve outreach to and a survey of municipalities and conservation authorities, the assessment process that I just described, and then the promotion of results and the development of a 4-year plan outlining the resources needed to complete this work in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Next slide, please. You may be wondering why municipalities or conservation authorities would be interested in participating in this project. And there are lots of good reasons. Contributing to the national target is just one. Another is that being counted adds an extra layer of recognition and consequently of scrutiny to the way these lands are being managed. There is nothing legally binding about the assessment results, but they do bring heightened public awareness, which presumably would make it more unlikely and more difficult to undo good policies and practices. Going through the assessment process is also a good way to identify strengths, weaknesses, or gaps in policies and practices. So on one hand, assessments can provide models of best practices to emulate, and on the other, they can pinpoint ways to make on-the-ground gains for conservation. And quite frankly, that's where Ontario Nature's interest lies. We want to see gains for conservation. The assessment process supports long-term planning through a careful look at policies and practices and where improvements could be made. It can also strengthen the case for funding proposals to support planning and management of conservation lands. And finally, these assessments provide an opportunity to be recognized as a leader in conservation. Over the past several weeks, for example, Ontario Nature has worked with several municipalities and conservation authorities on media releases to raise awareness of last year's assessments of the sites that went through successful screening processes. And there's been a lot of positive media coverage. Next slide, please. So thank you very much for listening. And when the time is right, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And thanks everyone, Anne, Dave, and Sarah for your presentations today, and really for your organizations and your partners' work ahead over the next year to get everything done. Hopefully we'll have another session that produces some of the results and highlights some of the results of your work. This does bring us to the last segment before we get to Q&A today. And this is to go over and highlight some additional actions that are also underway by SONC. One is some work being done by SIPS, which is the Cambium Indigenous Professional Services partner of SONC. And SIPS is developing a matrix of urban Indigenous organizations, First Nations, and Indigenous communities in the region. Additionally, SIPS with SONC is developing a statement on the inclusion of Indigenous harvesting rights within the Near Urban Nature Network. And this statement is going to support the inherent right to harvest on traditional territories. So this work, which Carrie Ann Charles is about to present, really continues the Indigenous engagement that began a couple of years ago with the Near Urban Nature Project. And so I'd like everyone to please join me in welcoming Carrie Ann Charles from SIPS. She's the Environmental Partnership Coordinator. And Carrie Ann, welcome.
Awesome. Thanks, Shelley. Onin Bojo, Carrie Ann Charles, Dishnakaz, Georgina Island, Dunjiba, Mayengan, Doram, Anishna Bekwa, and Dow. Thank you, everybody. My name is Carrie Ann. I'm from the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. I am the Partnership Coordinator for Cambium Indigenous Professional Services. I've been with Cambium for almost 5 years now. It's hard to believe. I do have a couple of team members that I do work with here from SIPS, Tiffany Taylor and Cassie McCowan, and we've been tasked with undertaking and supporting the SONC coalition with the Indigenous Engagement. So just a little bit about Cambium. We are an Indigenous owned, operated, and uniquely all Indigenous staffed environmental consulting organization. We are growing very quickly. We are now up to 16 staff, which is really good for us and a really good sign that people are taking notice and wanting to engage with the Indigenous communities on these important initiatives. So next slide, please, Brianna. So in terms of Indigenous engagement, SIPS, it's early and meaningful engagement with all interested Indigenous communities and peoples who may be affected by or have an interest in projects in an integral component of the process. So for us at SIPS, engagement is really a want to mentality rather than the have to mentality that we like to approach. It's less formal than consultation. It's reconciliation driven. It's historical and traditional knowledge that is being sought, and a desire to ensure content is accurate, respectful, and representative. We look for long-term relationships and partnerships and collaborations. And this, an engagement to us does not lead to projects that require that formal engagement. But if it does, this would be the first step in that consultation. So one of the other things that is really important to us at SIPS and the SIPS team in doing Indigenous engagement is ensuring that there's an understanding and an awareness of the complexities faced by the Indigenous peoples and communities, and that it's also an integral part of a meaningful engagement. And more importantly, I think than that is that people need to understand that time, resources, and capacity to do these things is of the utmost importance. And Shelley really mentioned that, and that's something that we really love about this coalition is their drive to support and their understanding and wanting to support the Indigenous communities and having their voices heard and meaningfully incorporated into the initiatives that are moving forward. Next slide, please, Brianna. So this has been a phased approach, as mentioned by Dave, I believe it was. This initiative did start a couple of years ago. And so phase one was really looking at the Williams Treaties First Nations and really trying to get a handle on what this engagement could look like. And so here in the map, you can see that there's a picture of the Great Gordon Horseshoe, and it was actually divided into 4 zones, with the Williams Treaties First Nations being zone 1. And so this phased approach included the Williams Treaties First Nations and seeking the input and providing information to those communities, which include the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Scugog, and the Chippewas of Beausoleil, Georgina, and Rama. With that, unfortunately, due to COVID, there were only 3 of the 7 communities that have been engaged thus far, but their insight has really brought some, their input has really brought some insight to the SONC team in regards to the process and what that meaningful inclusion of the Indigenous voices should look like. Next slide, please. So in terms of that, we are now embarking on phase 2 of the engagement. And the SIPS team is in the process of developing a matrix that Shelley had mentioned. And this matrix will be of the urban Indigenous organizations, as well as the Indigenous communities in the Southern Ontario near urban nature network region, also known as the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Once this matrix is completed, we will reach out and provide some information about the SONC work, as well as start to develop some relationships for future engagements. As part of this phase 2, the remaining Williams Treaties First Nations will also be sought out to be engaged and informed about what's going on with the Southern Ontario Nature Coalition and the near urban nature protection. The SIPS team will also be including those participants within the matrix in an overarching Indigenous engagement plan, which will support the future work for SONC and the larger Indigenous engagement. One of the things that we hope to do as well, and you've heard in this presentation, a couple of projects that are also having Indigenous engagement as part of those projects, is really building upon and strengthening SONC's memberships, relationships that they already have with Indigenous communities and organizations, as well as using the SONC team being all Indigenous and coming from parts of Ontario, all over Ontario, using our networks and our relationships with the Indigenous organizations and people to be able to create new and ensure collaborations and partnerships are being undertaken for future generations in this work. One of the things that is really important to the SIPS team in embarking in this work, being that we're looking at urban protected spaces is really ensuring that we're engaging with and creating partnerships with the urban Indigenous populations. So really trying to ensure that we're reaching out to all of the Indigenous organizations that can help us build relationships with the people within the greater Golden Horseshoe that can help us be specific in areas that we want to protect and preserve, and ensure that those Indigenous voices are being ingrained into the work that we're doing, so that those Indigenous folks that are within those urban settings can have spaces to go and reconnect and reassert their rights. Next slide, please. And with that, we have embarked, as Shelley mentioned, with the SONC team to develop what we're calling a harvesting rights statement. And so we are in the process of developing this statement that will build off the engagement that has taken place and will springboard from the commitments made within the land acknowledgement that the SONC team has developed. This statement will also acknowledge the members of the Williams Treaties First Nations and how we have just received a couple of years ago our constitutionally protected rights, or have not received, sorry, have reaffirmed our constitutionally protected rights to hunt and fish within our and gather within our territories. So within this harvesting statement, we're looking at really as a SONC, as a coalition, really standing behind those rights of the Indigenous peoples. And as we move forward with all of these projects in protecting and preserving and recreating urban Indigenous protected spaces, that we're also ensuring that we're including those Indigenous voices and ensuring that we're helping to reestablish and helping the Indigenous communities reassert those rights. Next slide. Next slide, Brina. Oh, sorry. There should have been one more slide in there, but that's okay. Our last slide is just me saying miigwech, and really, if you look in the report that was put out last year, there is the 7 grandfather teachings. And it's one of the things that I do myself personally when I get up every day. I really take a look at those 7 grandfather teachings and really try to uphold those in terms of humility, courage, honesty, wisdom, truth, trust, and love. And really that's what helps us as a SIPS team guide us in this very important undertaking, in ensuring that we're creating those spaces. And as Sarah had mentioned earlier, those ethical spaces where the Indigenous voices can come to the table and be equally heard and equally incorporated into the work that we're doing and moving forward, not just for us today, but for those next 7 generations and for all those beings within our world here on Mother Earth. So with that, miigwech.
And chi miigwech, Carrie Ann, and the full SIPS team of Tiffany and Cassandra for this work. This slide here has some further actions that are being undertaken by different community partners. I won't go into details, but you can read them when you get the presentation. But I will maybe highlight the Improving Large Parks Access Report. That was recently released by Green Infrastructure Ontario and the Greenbelt Foundation. So people may want to take a look at that particular report. Concluding slide, Deanna, thanks. So we wanted to include, as part of our presentation today, that we do really recognize the actions that many of you and others are taking that support the goals outlined here today. And we really encourage governments and organizations to reach out to us to identify how we can work together. We are, of course, seeking additional partnerships and investment in our efforts to support a near urban nature network for the Greater Golden Horseshoe and Southern Ontario. And we also welcome opportunities to communicate this work to other audiences. So if you have other groups that you work with, you think that would benefit from hearing about this work, please get in contact with us. And hopefully when the work is all done, you'll join us in similar sessions to understand the impacts of the work and next steps. Thanks very much.
So I think we were going to move briefly, Shelley, into some Q&As. We don't have a huge amount of time left, but there's been some great comments and resource sharing in the chat, as well as a number of questions, comments in the Q&A function. So we're sort of looking at both. Brianna probably will give us direction on what we should be doing, but maybe I'll start by noting there was a question by Bob Garson, and I think it's probably for Caroline in Canada, just about whether there's that effort is connected with Seed Change, BADA, Seeds of Diversity, and Terra Seed Alliance, Alderville First Nations, and Coburg Ecology Gardens. So I don't know if Sarah, you could give us a brief hint at sort of the connections to the larger landscape of work that's happening.
Not all of those are familiar to me on that list, but definitely worth checking out. So thanks for mentioning them. We've been focused on outreach to Indigenous communities and partners, and so we're also building like more relationships with local efforts that are going on already around things like planting seed orchards, things like that. So it's kind of quite a varied number of groups that we're connecting with. And we'll have our website up fairly soon. That should be able to get people can link in to what's going on and help build some of those connections.
Great. I see that Dave is responding to a question from Barb Heidenreich regarding some other areas that look like great opportunities. So Dave, if you're able to pick that one off with a written answer, that'd be terrific. Shelley, I didn't know if you saw anything else that you wanted to particularly highlight in terms of some of the questions. I think there's one for you, really, which is a question about are the ecological corridor mapping in the Greenbelt available in the supplementary reports?
Yes, in both the technical and the final report, the maps are there. So the final report, of course, is quite a bit thicker, or the technical report rather. So you may want to check that one out. And I think we provided a link to those reports on the Greenbelt Foundation website. They may also be in some of our partner websites too. And I think there may be a question for Faisal. If anyone wanted to talk about sort of the data behind any of the maps in our reports, you know, of course, you can also get in touch. But I think there was a question for Ontario Nature.
Faisal, I think you had a question for Anne about the criteria used in your review based on the IUCN criteria.
Oh, yeah, so I can answer that. Hi, Faisal. Nice to hear from you. The criteria we are using is actually the Federal Decision Support Tool. So there's a very specific tool with everything laid out that the federal government uses to determine whether something counts or not towards its database. So that is what we're using. And no, it doesn't talk about Indigenous capacity in these lands at all. It's those 4 criteria that I mentioned earlier in my presentation.
I also see a comment here from Andrew McCammon of Ontario Headwaters Institute, being a bit underwhelmed about the dearth of concerns about water. And yes, Andrew, it is implied, I think. The Greenbelt certainly is made up of water resource, agriculture, and natural heritage system. And, you know, from both, from an ecological network perspective, water is very much part of the picture. And in fact, a lot of the corridor work will center on, you know, those river valleys that extend, you know, from the Greenbelt down into Lake Ontario and up into Lake Simcoe and other areas. So the reports highlight water perhaps a bit more than the presentation did today, but rest assured it is a major focus alongside natural heritage.
Thanks, Shelley. There's a question from Laura Timms just about whether the Ontario seed strategy is looking into source seed from the more southern seed zones, i.e. northern US. I don't know if Sarah, you had any other comments. It's a pretty gargantuan effort. Some of this work on seeds and seeds for what climate, given the changes in climate. But Sarah, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I would have to say not yet in the whole process, but certainly that will be I think a topic for a working group to be addressing. The criteria for sourcing, the range that we're looking at, particularly in relation to climate change. So it's definitely something that's come up, but we haven't dived into it in a big way yet.
Okay, I don't know, Shelley, if you're seeing other questions or comments you wanted to highlight here.
No.
No. And maybe it's an opportunity then again to encourage people to look at some of the resources been shared and some of the other comments that are in the chat, because there's some interesting things there. I'm not sure, we're sort of at time and I'm not seeing many more comments coming in. I'm seeing lots of thanks and interesting ideas being put forward, Shelley. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add before we move toward conclusion.
No, just a really big thank you to the SONC partners for the great presentations today, and for everyone that attended the session. It was great attendance.
Yes, thanks to all, both participants and presenters. Really, really great session. Over to you, Brianna.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you do have any further comments or questions, please feel free to let us know. We will send out a post-webinar and presentation survey, so you'll have an opportunity to fill out that survey as well as submit any post questions. So we are, of course, happy to connect you with any members of the coalition should your questions be very, very specific. So a big thank you to all of our speakers today. A big thank you to SONC for your continued work over the last 2 going on 3 years. It's incredible to watch this project continue to grow and to be able to be here to support it. So thank you all very, very much. And thank you to all of our attendees and participants. We hope you have a fantastic day.